The bus was late, and for the first time in months, Leo was almost grateful for it. He stood there, under the dull gray awning of the bus stop, the worn leather of his work bag digging into his shoulder. The air smelled like wet concrete and exhaust, fumes, that particular city scent that settles in your clothes and never really leaves. He was alone, which was normal. The 7:15 p.m. bus was never crowded. It was the bus for the leftovers, the people who had nowhere better to be. People like him. His eyes, tired from a day spent staring at a screen that felt increasingly meaningless, scanned the sidewalk. Not for the bus. He was looking for the cat. He'd been doing this for weeks now. A part of him, the part that still felt foolish and hopeful, would clench up in the minutes before the bus arrived. A stupid, quiet anticipation. And then, like clockwork, the cat would appear. It was a Tom, a big bruiser of a thing with a coat the color of a stormy sky and one ear that looked like it had lost an argument with a lawnmower. He wasn't pretty. He was real. He'd just materialize from beneath the rusted green dumpster in the alley across the street. He never crossed the road. He'd just sit there, on the opposite curb, his tail tucked neatly around his paws. And he'd watch Leo. Not with hunger, not with the desperate, skittish energy of a stray looking for a handout. He just watched. His eyes, a startling, luminous green, were fixed on Leo with an intensity that felt like a physical touch. It was a ritual. Leo would get off the bus, shrug his bag higher on his shoulder, and pause. He'd look across the street. The cat would be there. They'd hold each other's gaze for a long, silent moment. Then Leo would nod, just once, a tiny, almost imperceptible dip of his chin, and the cat would turn and vanish back into the shadows of the alley, his job apparently done. It was the strangest, most consistent relationship in Leo's life. That night, the bus's air brakes hissed like a tired old man sighing. The doors clattered open. Leo stepped down onto the curb, the familiar weight of another empty evening settling on him. His apartment was 4 blocks away, a microwave dinner, the blue glow of the television, the silence that was so loud it sometimes rang in his ears. He'd moved here for a fresh start after the divorce, but all he'd found was a different shade of lonely. He turned, automatically, his body already performing the ritual before his mind had fully engaged. He looked across the street to the spot by the dumpster. The spot was empty. A weird, cold little jolt went through him. It was stupid. It was just a cat, a feral cat he'd never touched, never fed, never even heard meow. It had no obligation to him. It could be anywhere, hunting a mouse, sleeping on a warm pipe. It didn't owe him a performance, but the emptiness of that curb felt wrong. It felt like a punctuation mark at the end of a sentence he hadn't finished writing. The street was unusually quiet. A fine misting rain had started to fall, making halos around the streetlights and painting the asphalt black and shiny. The only sound was the rumble of the bus pulling away, leaving him alone in the damp silence. He stood there for a full minute, maybe 2, just staring at the empty space, waiting. His heart was doing a funny, nervous thump against his ribs. This was ridiculous. He was a 34-year-old man, feeling a genuine pang of anxiety because a stray cat had broken its weird, silent routine. He thought about the cat's eyes, that unblinking green stare. It never felt judgmental. It never felt pitying. It just felt present. In a world where Leo felt like a ghost drifting through his own life, that daily moment of pure animal attention had become an anchor. It was a witness, proof that he was still here, that someone, something, saw him come home. And now the witness was gone. The mist turned into a light drizzle, beating on his jacket. He should go home. He was getting wet for no reason. But his feet felt rooted to the spot. He replayed the last week in his head. Had anything been different? The cat had been there yesterday, and the day before. He'd seemed fine. Same steady gaze. Same calm demeanor. A car slushed through a puddle further down the street, the sound harsh in the quiet. The movement broke his trance. He shook his head, a sharp, frustrated motion. "Get a grip, Leo," he muttered to himself, the words swallowed. by the damp air. He finally turned away from the empty curb and started walking toward his apartment building. The 4 blocks felt longer than usual. The drizzle soaked into his hair, cold against his scalp. The streetlights cast long, distorted shadows that seemed to lean toward him. His hand, deep in his pocket, clenched around his keys. He kept glancing over his shoulder. A stupid, hopeful part of him thought maybe the cat was just running late. Maybe he'd appear, trotting down the sidewalk. But the street behind him remained empty. He reached his building, a bland brick rectangle that housed 100 other people living their own quiet, separate lives. He fumbled with the key, the metal cold and slippery in his wet fingers. He pushed the heavy door open and stepped into the lobby, which always smelled faintly of bleach and old carpet. The silence inside was even thicker than the silence outside. He walked up the 2 flights of stairs, his footsteps echoing in the stairwell. He unlocked his apartment door and pushed it open. The darkness inside was absolute. He flipped the light switch, and a weak yellow glow from a single lamp filled the small living room. It was neat. Too neat. A place where nothing was ever out of order because nothing ever happened. He dropped his bag by the door, shrugged off his wet jacket, and went to the kitchen. He didn't bother with the microwave dinner. He wasn't hungry. He filled a glass with tap water and stood at the sink, looking out the window into the dark well of the apartment building's air shaft. Nothing to see but other windows, some dark, some lit with the blue flicker of televisions. His mind wouldn't let it go. The empty curb, the absence of those green eyes. He thought about the last time he'd felt a loss this sharp, this specific. It was when Sarah had taken the last box out of their old house. She hadn't even looked back. She just got in her car and drove away. And he'd stood on the porch, feeling the space where she had been. A new, permanent emptiness in the world. This was smaller, of course. It was a cat. But the feeling was eerily similar. The sudden, silent cancellation of a ritual. The end of a quiet understanding. He walked over to the window that faced the street, even though he couldn't see the bus stop from here. He pulled the curtain aside and just stared into the night. The rain was coming down harder now, streaking the glass. "Where are you?" The question formed in his mind, clear and desperate. He hadn't realized how much he'd come to rely on that one moment of connection. It was the highlight of his day. The one thing he could count on. And now it was gone. He thought about the cat's rough life. The torn ear. The scars you could see if you looked closely along his flank. He was a fighter. A survivor. The city was full of dangers. Cars. Other animals. Cruel people. Disease. A cold knot of dread tightened in his stomach. Something was wrong. He knew it. He felt it in his bones. A deep, primal certainty. This wasn't just the cat deciding to change his schedule. This was different. He finished his water and put the glass in the sink. The apartment felt colder than usual. Emptier. He went through the motions of getting ready for bed. But his mind was across the street, in that alley, searching the shadows. He lay in bed in the dark, listening to the rain tap against the window. He replayed the image of the cat in his mind. The way he'd sit, so still and patient. The intelligent gleam in his eyes. The quiet dignity of him. And for the first time, Leo admitted to himself the truth he'd been avoiding. It wasn't just about the cat waiting for him. It was about him waiting for the cat. Every day, on that bus ride home, a small part of him was already there on that curb, anticipating that moment of silent recognition. It was the thing that got him through the long, empty afternoons. Now that was gone. The ritual was broken. The anchor had slipped, and he was adrift again. He closed his eyes, but sleep wouldn't come. All he could see was the empty curb, slick with rain, waiting for someone who wasn't coming back. You're here, listening, and that means more than you know. If you feel safe in these stories, your one subscribe helps me keep this quiet little corner alive. Thank you for being part of this peaceful world. The next morning, the rain had stopped, but the world was left looking bruised and damp. Leo woke up with a heaviness in his chest that had nothing to do with the weather. The first thought that pierced the fog of sleep was the empty curb. It was a dull ache, a missing tooth his tongue couldn't stop probing. His usual routine felt hollow. The coffee tasted like bitter water. The toast was like ash in his mouth. He caught himself staring out the kitchen window, not at the air shaft, but down toward the street, as if he could somehow see the alley from 4 stories up. He was dressed and out the door earlier than usual, a nervous energy thrumming under his skin. The bus stop was different in the morning, bustling with people, the air filled with the smell of perfume, coffee, and impatient sighs. No one looked at each other. Everyone was in their own bubble, headphones on, eyes glued to phones. It was the opposite of the lonely, quiet communion of the evening. Leo stood there, feeling the press of bodies, and felt more alone than ever. The workday was a blur of spreadsheets and emails that seemed to scroll on into infinity. He couldn't concentrate. His mind kept drifting back to the cat. He found himself searching for pictures of gray cats on the internet, zooming in on their eyes, looking for that specific shade of green. He felt a pang of guilt. He'd never even tried to get close to him. He'd just accepted the ritual, taken it for granted. He'd never offered food, never spoken a word to him. He'd just taken. The clock on his computer screen seemed to crawl. 2 p.m. felt like 5 p.m. 4 p.m. felt like midnight. When it was finally time to leave, a knot of anxiety and hope tightened in his stomach. This was irrational. It was a stray cat. They disappear. They move on. They get chased off by dogs or bigger cats. They get picked up by animal control. The reasons were endless, and most of them didn't have happy endings, but he couldn't shake the feeling. The cat hadn't just moved on. Something was wrong. The evening bus ride home was agony. Every red light felt personal. Every stop felt interminable. He stared out the window, watching the city blur past, his knee bouncing with a nervous energy he couldn't contain. The man next to him glanced over, annoyed, and Leo forced himself to be still. Finally, the bus turned onto his street. His heart was hammering against his ribs. He stood up before the bus had fully stopped, earning a sharp look from the driver. He stumbled to the door, his eyes already scanning the sidewalk across the street. The green dumpster, the cracked pavement, the shadows deepening in the alley. Empty. The disappointment was a physical blow, a cold wave that washed over him, leaving him numb. He stepped off the bus, the doors hissing shut behind him. He didn't move. He just stood there, rooted to the spot, staring at the void. The ritual was broken. The anchor was truly gone. He didn't know how long he stood there. Long enough for the bus to rumble away and for the street to fall into its evening quiet. The sound of a distant siren wailed, then faded. A breeze kicked up, rustling a discarded chip bag down the gutter. It was the loneliest sound he'd ever heard. He was about to turn, to trudge those 4 long blocks to his silent apartment, when a movement caught his eye. Not from the alley. From underneath a parked car, 3 vehicles down from the dumpster. Shift in the shadows. A glint of green. Leo's breath hitched. He took a half step forward, then stopped, not wanting to scare whatever it was away. He squinted, trying to pierce the gloom under the car. And then he saw him. It was the cat. But it wasn't. He was crouched low, his belly pressed to the cold asphalt. His normally proud head was down, and he wasn't looking at Leo. He was staring, fixedly down the street, his body tense, every muscle coiled. He looked smaller. Diminished. "Hey!" Leo whispered, the word barely audible. The cat's ear, the torn one, twitched. But he didn't turn. He didn't acknowledge Leo at all. His focus was absolute, and it was pointed elsewhere. A cold dread, different from the disappointment, seeped into Leo's veins. This wasn't the calm, observant cat from before. This was an animal gripped by fear. Or pain. Slowly, so slowly, it felt like moving through syrup. Leo took a step off the curb, then another. He crossed the street, his eyes never leaving the cat under the car. The cat still didn't move. He was completely frozen. As Leo got closer, he could see more details. The cat's fur was matted with mud on one side. There was a fresh scratch along his flank, a thin, angry red line against the gray. But it was his posture that was the most alarming. He was hunched, protecting himself. Leo stopped about 5 feet from the car. He crouched down, trying to make himself small, non-threatening. The pavement was cold and damp through the fabric of his pants. "Hey, buddy," he said, his voice soft. "What's going on? Where were you last night?" The cat's eyes finally flickered toward him. There was no recognition in them, no steady calm, just a wide, wary fear. He let out a sound. Not a meow, not a hiss. A low, guttural groan that seemed to come from deep within him. It was a sound of pure distress. Leo's heart broke. This was so much worse than the cat just not showing up. This was seeing the strong, silent creature he'd come to admire brought low by something he couldn't see or understand. He stayed there, crouched on the cold ground, for what felt like an eternity. He didn't speak again. He just tried to project calm, tried to let the cat know he wasn't a threat. He just waited. Have you ever had an animal wait for you, even when you didn't ask them to? This was the reverse. Leo was waiting for him, and he realized in that moment that this was the first time he'd ever really waited for anything. He'd waited for promotions, for dates, for his life to start. But this was different. This was active, patient waiting. This was bearing witness to another creature's pain. Slowly, infinitesimally, the cat's posture began to change. The tight coil of his muscles loosened, just a fraction. The intense, fearful stare down the street softened. His head turned, just a little, and his green eyes fully found Leo's. The fear was still there. But something else was there too. A flicker of the old familiarity. A question. Leo held his gaze. He didn't move. He barely breathed. The cat's tail, which had been tucked tightly against his body, gave one slow, tentative twitch. It was a tiny movement, but to Leo, it felt like an earthquake. It was communication. It was a sign of life. A car turned onto the street, its headlights sweeping over them. The cat flinched, shrinking back deeper under the car. The moment of connection shattered. The car drove past, and the street was dark again. Leo knew he couldn't stay here all night. It was getting colder, and whatever had spooked the cat was still out there, a phantom threat in the growing dark. "I'm not going to hurt you," he whispered. I'm here." He slowly, carefully, reached into his work bag. His fingers closed around the apple he'd packed for lunch and forgotten to eat. It wasn't much, but it was something. He placed it on the ground midway between himself and the car, a stupid, hopeless peace offering. The cat looked at the apple, then back at Leo, his expression unreadable. "It's all I have," Leo said, feeling foolish. He straightened up, his knees cracking in protest. He took a step back, then another. The cat watched him, his eyes wide. "I'll be back tomorrow," Leo said. It was a promise. To the cat, to himself. He turned and finally walked home. The 4 blocks felt different. The silence wasn't just empty anymore. It was filled with worry. The night felt watchful. He kept glancing over his shoulder, but the cat stayed under the car. When he got to his apartment, he went straight to the window and looked down the street. He couldn't see the parked car from here, but he stared in its direction anyway. He ordered a pizza, not because he was hungry, but because it was a thing people did. He ate 1 slice standing at the counter. His mind was racing. He needed a plan. He couldn't just leave an apple. He needed real food. Maybe a blanket. Something. He spent the evening researching online. What to feed a stray cat. How to gain their trust. He learned about slow blinks, how it was a sign of trust in cat language. He read about not making direct eye contact, about moving slowly. He felt like he was preparing for a first date with the most important person in the world. The next day, he went to the store on his lunch break. He bought a small bag of dry cat food, the premium kind with real salmon, because it felt wrong to get the cheap stuff. He bought a small, shallow bowl. He felt like a crazy person, standing in the pet aisle, his heart pounding with a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. The workday was another exercise in torture. The clock was his enemy. But finally, it was time. He got off the bus, his bag now heavier with the food and bowl. His eyes went straight to the parked car. The space underneath was empty. His hope plummeted. But then he scanned the alley. And there, back in his original spot by the dumpster, was the cat. He was sitting up. He wasn't crouched in fear. He was cleaner, though the mud had dried into a patch on his fur. He was watching Leo. The fear was gone from his eyes, replaced by a weary, cautious watchfulness. Leo's breath left him in a rush. He was back. He'd come back to their spot. Slowly, Leo approached. He stopped a respectful distance away. He didn't crouch this time. He just stood there. "Hey," he said softly. The cat's ears swiveled forward. He was listening. Leo slowly, so slowly, slid his bag off his shoulder and placed it on the ground. He unzipped it, the sound loud in the quiet street. The cat watched every movement, his body tense but not frozen in fear. Leo took out the bowl, then the bag of food. The rustle of the bag made the cat's eyes go wide. Leo poured a small mound of the brown kibble into the bowl. The smell, fishy and rich, wafted into the air. He placed the bowl on the ground exactly where he usually stood. Then he took 5 large steps backward, giving the cat all the space in the world. The cat stared at the bowl. He looked at Leo, back at the bowl. His nose twitched. Leo could see the internal battle happening behind those green eyes. Hunger versus caution. Trust versus a lifetime of learning not to. Leo remembered what he'd read. He slowly, deliberately, closed his eyes for a long second, then opened them. A slow blink. The cat stared, unblinking. Leo did it again. This time, after a long moment, the cat gave him a slow, deliberate blink back. It was nothing. It was everything. It was a conversation, a treaty. The cat stood up. He stretched, his body elongating, a gesture of tentative normalcy. He took 1 step toward the bowl, then another. He was moving stiffly, favoring his right front paw slightly. Leo hadn't even noticed the limp before. He reached the bowl. He sniffed the food once, twice. Then he looked directly at Leo, as if for final permission. Leo gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. The same nod he'd given every night for months. The cat lowered his head and began to eat. It wasn't a frantic, starving gobble. It was measured, delicate even. The sound of his crunching on the kibble was the only sound on the street. Leo stood there, his hands in his pockets, and watched. A feeling bloomed in his chest, warm and expansive. It was relief. It was joy. It was a connection so profound, it made his eyes sting. He wasn't just a spectator anymore. He was a participant. The cat ate until the bowl was clean. He sat back, licked his lips meticulously, and then did the most astonishing thing. He didn't run away. He didn't vanish into the alley. He took a few steps toward Leo. He stopped about 2 feet away, well within touching distance. He looked up at Leo, his green eyes clear and calm. Then he turned, and with a quiet grace, he walked back to his spot by the dumpster. He sat down, tucked his tail around his paws, and resumed his watch. But it was different now. He wasn't just watching Leo come home. He was waiting for Leo to come back. The routine had changed. It had deepened. It had become a bond. And as Leo finally turned to walk home, the cold night air didn't feel cold at all. For the first time in a very long time, he felt seen. He felt needed. And the 4 blocks to his apartment felt like a path leading somewhere, instead of a road to nowhere. The world had color again. It was a subtle shift, like someone had slowly turned up a dimmer switch Leo hadn't even known was there. The gray of his apartment walls felt softer. The blear of the city lights outside his window held a faint, almost golden haze. The microwave dinners even tasted a little less like despair. It was all because of a small, cracked plastic bowl and a big, gray tomcat with eyes the color of spring leaves. The ritual had evolved. It was no longer just a silent nod across a busy street. It was a daily appointment Leo lived for. Every evening, his work bag was now heavier with a small Tupperware container of premium kibble and a bottle of water. He'd get off the bus, his heart doing a little anticipatory skip, and there Ash would be. He'd named him Ash. It had just come to him one night, looking at the cat's storm gray fur. It fit. It was strong, simple, and a little bit weathered, just like him. Ash was always waiting by the dumpster now, but he no longer kept his distance. As Leo approached, he would rise, stretch his front legs out with a quiet grunt, and amble over to the spot where Leo would place the bowl. He'd rub his cheek against the rusted leg of the bus stop bench. A scent-marking gesture Leo had read about, a sign of ownership and comfort. Leo would pour the food, fill the second bowl with water, and step back. Ash would begin to eat, but now he did so with one ear perpetually swiveled toward Leo, a sign of trust that he was no longer seen as a threat, but as a part of the process. A safe presence, and Leo would talk to him. He'd tell him about his day, the mind-numbing boredom of a spreadsheet that wouldn't balance, the passive-aggressive email from his boss, the way the coffee machine in the break room had made a suspicious gurgling sound and then died. He talked about the divorce sometimes, not the angry parts, but the quiet, lonely parts. The feeling of coming home to an empty house that still, somehow felt full of another person's absence. "The silence is the worst part, Ash," he said one evening, as the cat meticulously cleaned a paw after his meal. "It's not even silence. It's like the echo of all the conversations we're not having." Ash paused his grooming, his paw held mid-lick, and looked at Leo. He blinked his slow blink. Leo blinked back. It was their language, a vocabulary of glances and small movements that said more than words ever could. "Do you think animals know when we're at our lowest?" Leo knew the answer now. They didn't know the details, the complicated, messy reasons for the pain. But they knew the shape of it. They could smell it on you, like rain in the air. They could feel the vibration of it in your stillness. Ash had known, and he'd chosen to stay. The fear began to seep in slowly, a cold trickle in the warmth of their new routine. It was the fear of this ending, the fear of coming back to an empty spot, the fear of the fragile, beautiful thing they'd built just vanishing. Every time Ash wasn't immediately visible, Leo's heart would stutter until he saw a gray ear twitch from behind the dumpster or the tip of a tail flicking from under the bench. And then, the gifts started. It was a Tuesday, a cold, clear night, where the stars were just faint pinpricks against the city's orange glow. Ash had finished eating and was sitting, washing his face, his rough tongue scraping over his fur. Leo was packing up the bowls, preparing to head home. Ash stood up, gave a full-body shake, and trotted not toward his alley, but toward Leo. He stopped at Leo's feet, looked up, and dropped something from his mouth. It landed on the toe of Leo's shoe with a soft, almost inaudible plink. It was a feather. A small, perfect gray-blue pigeon feather, its tip stained a rusty brown. Leo froze. He stared at it, then at Ash. The cat just looked back at him, his expression unreadable, then turned and disappeared into his alley for the night. Leo bent down and picked up the feather. It was incredibly soft. He held it between his fingers, utterly bewildered. Was this a payment? A token? Had Ash just brought him a piece of a kill? The thought was slightly grotesque, but the gesture felt purposeful. It felt like communication. He took the feather home. He didn't know why. He placed it on his kitchen counter. A little gray question mark on the formica. He didn't think much more of it until 2 days later. This time, it was a bottle cap. A twist-off from a glass soda bottle, the metal bent and dull. Ash dropped it next to the food bowl, gave Leo a long look, and then left. The next gift was a strip of red ribbon, frayed and dirty, about 6 inches long. Then another feather, this one a stark white, from maybe a seagull. It became a pattern. Every few days after he'd eaten, Ash would present him with something. It was never anything of obvious value. A smooth gray stone, a piece of green sea glass worn opaque by the ocean, a single battered Christmas ornament, its silver coating flaking off. That must have been lost in a gutter a year ago. Leo started a collection on his windowsill. The little pile of junk grew. To anyone else, it would look like trash. But to Leo, it was a museum of their friendship. Each item was a mystery. Where was he finding them? Was he venturing further afield? Was he bringing them from some hidden hoard? The gifts were never given when Ash was hungry or asking for food. They were only ever presented after the meal, as a closing ritual. A thank you, maybe. Or I was thinking of you. But the cold trickle of fear turned into a steady drip. Because with the gifts came other changes. Ash's disappearances grew longer. Some days, he wouldn't be at the bus stop at all. Leo would wait, his food container growing heavy in his hand, the knot in his stomach pulling tighter with each passing minute. Sometimes, after 20 minutes of anxious waiting, Ash would come trotting up from the opposite direction of his alley, his paws dusty, a look of intense purpose on his face. He was going somewhere, doing something. One afternoon, a Saturday, Leo decided to try something. He'd bought a small, soft-sided pet carrier, just in case. He'd also bought a can of the stinkiest, most expensive wet food he could find, a gourmet trout pâté that promised to entice the most finicky of felines. He had a plan. A crazy, probably stupid plan. The weather was turning. A cold front was moving in, and the sky was the color of lead. The air had a bitter edge to it. Winter was coming, and the thought of Ash sleeping under a dumpster, exposed to the wind and snow, was making Leo feel physically ill. He couldn't stand it anymore. He had to try to bring him inside, just for the night, just to see. He approached the bus stop, the carrier in one hand, the open can of trout pâté in the other. The smell was potent. Ash was already there, waiting. His nose twitched violently at the scent of the food. He let out a sound Leo had never heard before, a short, eager chirp. "Hey, buddy," Leo said, his voice tight with nerves. "I got you a treat, a really good one." He placed the carrier on the ground, its door propped open. He spooned a generous amount of the wet food onto a paper plate and placed it just inside the carrier's entrance. Ash approached, his tail held high, intrigued by the new, delicious smell. He sniffed the air, then the food on the plate. He took a tentative lick, then another. He was hooked. He stepped fully into the carrier to get better access to the plate. This was it. This was the moment. Leo's hand trembled as he reached for the carrier's door. But just as his fingers touched the plastic, Ash's head snapped up. He wasn't looking at Leo. He was looking past him, down the street, his body instantly rigid. The food was forgotten. A low growl rumbled in his chest, a sound so full of primal warning that the hair on Leo's arms stood up. Leo turned to see what he was looking at. A moving van. A big 20-foot truck, painted a bland beige, was parked 3 houses down from the bus stop. 2 men were carrying a couch up the walkway. Ash erupted from the carrier like a shot. He didn't just run. He fled. He was a gray streak, shooting across the street without looking, a horn blaring as a car slammed on its brakes. He vanished into his alley, moving faster than Leo had ever seen him move. The carrier lay on its side, the door swinging. The plate of expensive trout pâté was untouched. The only evidence of Ash's panic was a single muddy paw print on the concrete next to it. Leo stood there, his heart hammering, a cold dread washing over him. It wasn't the moving van itself. It was what it represented: change, disruption, the end of something. That night, Ash didn't come back for his dinner. Leo waited until the streetlights flickered on, casting long, lonely shadows. The wind picked up, whistling through the alleyways, carrying the first frozen promise of snow. The next day, Sunday, Leo went back in the morning, and in the afternoon, and in the evening. He brought the dry food. He brought the wet food. He stood there for an hour each time, calling Ash's name softly, a sound swallowed by the vast, indifferent city. Nothing. The curb was empty. The alley was silent. The windowsill collection of feathers and bottle caps seemed to mock him, little monuments to a friendship that had been severed by a sound, a sight, a memory he couldn't understand. On Monday, he called out sick from work. He couldn't face the spreadsheet. He couldn't face the bus ride. He spent the day walking the neighborhood, his eyes scanning every porch, every parked car, every shadow. He asked a few people if they'd seen a big gray cat with a torn ear. They shook their heads, barely looking at him, hurrying on their way. He was a ghost again, searching for another ghost. The fear was no longer a drip. It was a flood. It was a cold, certain knowledge that something was terribly wrong. This wasn't a temporary disappearance. This was different. The moving van had triggered something deep and feral in Ash. A fear so profound it had overridden his hunger, his trust, his routine. Leo stood at the bus stop that Monday evening, the empty food bowl in his hand. The wind cut through his jacket, like it wasn't even there. The first few flakes of snow began to fall, tiny and hesitant, melting the moment they touched the ground. He looked at the alley, a dark mouth waiting to swallow the light. He looked at the empty space where Ash should be. The silence was back. The echo was back. It was louder than ever, and then he saw it. Tucked almost out of sight behind the leg of the bus stop bench was a new gift. It must have been left just before. Whatever happened. Before the van. Before the flight. It was a child's mitten. Tiny. Meant for a toddler. It was bright, fluorescent pink, and it was clean, as if it had been lost very recently. One side of it was smudged with dirt, and stuck to the fuzzy fabric were several long gray cat hairs. Leo picked it up. It was so small in his hand. It felt unbearably fragile. This was the most deliberate gift yet. It was new. It was specific. It was from a world Ash had been investigating, a world of houses and families and children. He clutched the tiny pink mitten in his fist, the synthetic yarn scratchy against his skin. The snow fell a little harder now, dusting his shoulders and hair. The mystery was no longer a curious puzzle. It was a desperate race. Where was he getting these things? And more importantly, where was he now? The gifts were a trail, a breadcrumb path left by a creature who was trying to tell him something. And Leo had been too dense, too wrapped up in his own comfort to understand. The ritual was over. The waiting was over. It was time to follow the trail. The pink mitten burned a hole in his pocket. It was all he could think about. That tiny, garish splash of color in a world that had gone gray and white with falling snow. He stood there until the flakes began to stick, dusting the shoulders of his jacket and the toes of his shoes like powdered sugar. The cold was a physical presence now, seeping through his clothes, biting at the tips of his ears. But the cold, inside him, was worse. It was the cold of fear, of failure. He had to move. Standing there, waiting for a ghost to return, was useless. Ash was out there, somewhere, scared and alone in a freezing city. And he had left a trail of feathers, and bottle caps and ribbon. A trail that ended with a child's mitten. Leo turned and started walking, his movements stiff, robotic. He didn't have a plan. He just knew he had to follow the direction Ash had come from when he'd arrived with his gifts. Away from the alley, away from the bus stop, deeper into the neighborhood. The snow muted everything. The sound of his footsteps was swallowed by the white blanket. The world was hushed, holding its breath. He walked past rows of houses, their windows glowing with warm yellow light. He could see figures moving inside, people cooking dinner, watching TV, living their lives, normal insulated lives. He felt like an astronaut floating outside a spaceship, looking in at a world he could no longer reach. He stopped at every house, peering into driveways, scanning porches, looking for any sign of a gray cat. He saw a ceramic gnome wearing a tiny, knit cap, a forgotten tricycle, its wheels slowly being buried in snow, a pair of rubber boots left by a door, but no Ash. His hope, a fragile little flame, began to sputter. This was insane. He was looking for a needle in a haystack the size of a city block. The snow was falling harder now, big, wet flakes that clung to his eyelashes and blurred his vision. He was getting soaked. His fingers were numb inside his gloves. He found himself standing on a corner, utterly lost and defeated. He didn't know which way to go. The trail was cold. Literally. He pulled the pink mitten from his pocket, staring at it as the snow settled on the fuzzy fabric. Why this? Why had Ash brought him this of all things? It was so specific, so human. A child's mitten. His eyes lifted from the mitten and scanned the houses on this new street. They were smaller here, older. Bungalows with postage stamp yards. And then he saw it. Tied to the porch railing of a pale blue house halfway down the block was a cluster of deflated helium balloons. Silver ones. and a single bright pink one, faded by the weather. A birthday party. There was a faint, ghostly outline on the lawn where a bounce house might have been. A recent party. A party where a toddler might have lost a mitten. His heart began to thud, a dull, heavy drumbeat in his chest. This was it. This had to be it. He started walking toward the blue house, his pace quickening, his breath pluming out, in frantic white clouds. He didn't go to the front door. That felt too intrusive. Instead, he cut through the side yard, his boots crunching through the untouched snow. The backyard was small, dominated by a large, bare oak tree and a tool shed that was leaning wearily to one side. The snow was deeper back here, unmarked except for a single set of tiny, crisscrossing tracks. Bird tracks. No cat tracks. The disappointment was a sucker punch to the gut. He'd been so sure. He leaned against the rough, cold wood of the tool shed, closing his eyes. He was cold, tired, and utterly foolish. He was a grown man, chasing a cat through a snowstorm based on a trail of garbage and a hunch. He was about to push himself away from the shed and trudge back home, a perfect portrait of misery, when he heard it. A sound. So faint he thought he'd imagined it. He froze, listening, every sense straining. There it was again, a tiny, high-pitched mewling. It wasn't Ash, it was something else. Something small, and desperate, and cold. It was coming from inside the tool shed. He turned and faced the shed door. It was secured by a simple latch, but no lock. His numb fingers fumbled with the cold metal, his heart hammering so hard he could feel it in his throat. The latch gave with a rusty shriek. He pulled the door open. The interior was dark, smelling of old grass clippings, motor oil, and damp wood. The weak afternoon light filtered through the dusty, cobweb-festooned window, illuminating motes of dust dancing in the air, and then he saw her. In the far corner, nestled in a nest of mildewed burlap sacks, was Ash. She was curled tightly into a ball, her fur fluffed up against the cold, and pressed against her belly, squirming and mewling, were 4 tiny kittens. Their eyes were still closed, their bodies no bigger than plums, their fur just a faint fuzz over pink skin. Leo's breath left his body in a rush. He couldn't move. He couldn't speak. The world narrowed to this single, shocking image. Ash. She was Ash. She was a mother. She lifted her head slowly. She looked exhausted, her eyes dull. But when she saw him, standing in the doorway, she didn't hiss. She didn't growl. She didn't try to hide her babies. She just looked at him. And in that look he saw everything. The weeks of secret toil. The desperate searches for food not just for herself, but for them. The gifts. They hadn't been tokens of affection. They had been cries for help. A language she didn't know how to speak. See? See what I found? See what I have? See what... I need the moving van. It hadn't just scared her. It had sounded like the one that had taken her previous family away. The one that had left her behind. She'd thought it was happening again. She'd run to protect her babies. Trembling, Leo took a step into the shed. Then another. He sank too, his knees in the cold dirt, the snow melting against his pants. He was crying, silent tears tracking cold lines down his face. He hadn't known. He had been so blind. "Oh, Ash," he whispered, his voice cracking. "Oh, buddy. I'm so sorry." "I didn't know." She watched him, her body still tense, protecting her kittens. One of the tiny creatures let out a particularly piercing mewl, a sound of pure distress. Ash bent her head, licking it frantically, trying to soothe it, but she was so thin, so weak. She didn't have enough to give. Leo knew what he had to do. He couldn't leave them here. The temperature was dropping, the shed was freezing. They wouldn't survive the night. He slowly, so slowly it felt like moving through a dream, shrugged off his backpack. He unzipped it with shaking, clumsy fingers. He pulled out the Tupperware container of dry food. Then the can of trout pâté he'd bought days ago. He popped the lid. The rich, fishy smell filled the cold air. Ash's head snapped up. Her eyes locked onto the can. A low, hungry sound rumbled in her chest. But she didn't move. She wouldn't leave her kittens. Leo didn't try to bring the food to her. He didn't try to touch her or the babies. He just placed the open can on the ground about 3 feet from her nest. Then he poured a pile of kibble next to it, an offering, a peace treaty. He backed away, retreating to the doorway, giving her space. He crouched down, making himself small, non-threatening. It took a full minute. A minute of intense internal struggle he could see playing out in the tension of her body. Hunger, fear, trust. Finally, the need to survive, for herself and for her babies, won. She uncurled herself from around the kittens, giving them one last anxious lick. She stood up, her body swaying slightly with weakness. She kept her eyes on Leo as she crept toward the food. When she reached it, she didn't devour it. She ate fast, but daintily, her eyes flicking back to her corner every few seconds. Leo stayed perfectly still, barely breathing. He was a statue, a guardian at the gate. When she was done, she didn't immediately return to the nest. She sat where she was, licking her chops clean. She looked at Leo, really looked at him. The fear in her eyes was still there, but it was now mingled with something else. Something like assessment, calculation, and then she did the thing that shattered Leo's heart and put it back together again all at once. She took a step toward him, then another. She walked right up to him, until she was so close he could feel the faint warmth of her body, could smell the scent of old hay and fish on her breath. She looked up into his face, her green eyes deep and bottomless. Slowly, hesitantly, she leaned forward and pressed the top of her head, the spot right between her ears, into his trembling, open palm. It was the first time he had ever touched her. Her fur was softer than he had imagined, and she was warm. So warm. She began to purr, a sound so deep and resonant it vibrated up through his hand, through his arm, and straight into the core of his being. It was a sound of absolute, earth-shattering trust. It was a sound that said, "I choose you. Help us." Leo's composure broke. A sob escaped him, raw and ragged. He didn't move his hand. He just let her lean into him, let her purr vibrate through him. He cried for her struggle, for her strength, for the kittens she'd been trying to protect all alone. He cried for his own loneliness, which she had filled without ever asking for anything in return. He cried because he finally understood. She hadn't been waiting for him at the bus stop for herself. She had been waiting for him for them. She was scouting, she was testing. She was looking for a safe harbor, a port in the storm for her tiny, vulnerable crew, and she had chosen him. The quiet, broken man who got off the late bus. She had seen something in him he hadn't seen in himself, a capacity for love, the ability to be steady, a kindness she could trust. After a long moment, she pulled her head away from his hand. The loss of contact was a physical ache. She turned and walked back to her nest, curling her body around her babies once more. The purr didn't stop. It was a soft, continuous rumble, a lullaby for her kittens, a benediction for him. Leo knew what he had to do. He stood up, his legs stiff and cold. He pulled out his phone. His fingers, now warm with a new purpose, dialed the number for a rideshare. Then he called the only 24-hour emergency vet clinic in the area, his voice surprisingly steady as he explained the situation. He didn't have the carrier. It was still back at the bus stop. But he had his coat. He carefully, gently unzipped it. He approached the nest. Ash watched him, her purr stuttering for a second, then resuming. She trusted him. "It's okay, Mama," he whispered. "I've got you. I've got all of you." He used the burlap sacks to carefully, ever so gently, scoop the entire nest, Ash, and all 4 kittens, into the warm cocoon of his open jacket. He cradled them against his chest. Ash peered out from the folds of fabric, her eyes wide but calm. One of the kittens mewled. He could feel their tiny heartbeats against his own. He walked out of the tool shed, leaving the door open. He walked through the falling snow, a man carrying a secret, precious world in his arms. The headlights of the waiting car cut through the twilight, illuminating the swirling flakes. He looked down at Ash's face, nestled in the fabric of his jacket. She blinked her slow, trusting blink at him. He finally saw what she had been trying to tell him all along. It wasn't a mystery. It was an invitation. It was a family. The first few days were a blur of frantic, tender chaos. The emergency vet visit had stretched deep into the night, a surreal dreamscape of bright lights and clinical smells. Ash, whose name now felt permanently etched onto his soul, had been a perfect lady. Exhausted, dehydrated, but fundamentally healthy. A fighter. The kittens, 3 boys and a girl, the vet said, were miraculously okay. Small, but strong. Their tiny mews, which had sounded so desperate in the shed, now filled Leo's apartment with a new, urgent music. He'd set them up in a cardboard box fortress lined with every soft towel and blanket he owned, placed in the corner of his living room where the morning sun would hit. Ash had taken to domesticity not as a prisoner, but as a queen, finally claiming her throne. She would nurse her babies, her purr a constant, contented motor, her eyes half closed in a state of blissful exhaustion. But her gaze would often find Leo, wherever he was in the room, and she would hold it for a long moment, a silent communication passing between them. "Thank you. We are safe." Leo's life, once defined by empty silence, was now filled with sound. The rustle of kittens squirming over each other. The soft pert sound Ash made when he approached the box. The gentle crunch of kibble being eaten from a proper ceramic bowl placed permanently in his kitchen. The apartment smelled different too. No more stale air and microwave dinners. It smelled of warm fur and the faint, sweet scent of kitten milk. He'd taken a week off work. His boss, hearing the slightly shell-shocked, emotional tremor in his voice over the phone, had surprisingly agreed without question. Leo spent his days on the floor next to the box, watching the miracle unfold. He watched their eyes open, tiny blue orbs that would later change color, blinking against the new light. He watched them take their first wobbly steps, their little bodies swaying like drunken sailors on the towel-covered landscape. He gave them names, silly names that made him smile. The biggest of the boys, a bold gray replica of his mother, was Bruiser. The smallest, more tentative one, was Peanut. The girl, with a tiny smudge of white on her chest, was Pearl. And the last boy, the adventurous one who was always first to try to escape the box, was Scout. He talked to them constantly. He told them about his day, which now consisted of laundry, and washing bottles and watching them sleep. He told them about their mother, how brave and clever she was. He told them they would never know cold or hunger or fear. It was a promise he intended to keep with every fiber of his being. The world outside his windows kept turning. The snow fell and melted and fell again. The city buses rumbled past on their endless loops. But inside, time moved differently. It was measured in feedings and weight gains, in milestones so small they would be invisible to anyone else. The first time Peanut successfully made it to the edge of the box without falling over was a cause for celebration. The first time Ash felt secure enough to leave the nest and hop onto the couch next to Leo, placing one paw on his leg as if to say, "Watch them for a minute, will you?" was a moment that stole his breath away. The fear was still there, of course, a low-level hum of anxiety that he would mess it up, that he wouldn't see a sign of illness, that he wouldn't be enough. But it was overshadowed by a profound, grounding sense of purpose. He was needed. Not for a project deadline, not for a performance review. He was needed for his warmth, his presence, his steady hands. It was the most important job he'd ever had. Weeks bled into a month. The kittens were little tornadoes of energy, tearing around the apartment, chasing dust motes in the sunbeams, and pouncing on their mother's tail. Ash tolerated it all with a goddess's patience, though Leo would sometimes catch her looking at him with an expression that clearly read, "You see what I have to deal with?" She had her routines now. She would meet him at the door when he came back from grocery runs, weaving figure eights through his legs. She slept at the foot of his bed, a warm, purring weight on the blankets. But she still had her wild soul. She would sit for hours on the back of the armchair, watching the pigeons on the windowsill, her tail twitching. She never tried to get out. It was as if she'd chosen this. She'd fought for this safety, and she had no intention of leaving it. One evening, Leo was on the floor, a kitten climbing each leg like a miniature mountain, another batting at a loose thread on his sweater. Ash was curled on the couch, watching the scene with her usual serene dignity. The TV was off. The only light came from a single lamp, casting a soft, golden glow over the room. He looked around, at the scratching post he'd assembled somewhat crookedly, at the collection of toys scattered across the rug, at the 5 creatures who had utterly, completely taken over his life and his heart. The silence was there, but it was no longer an empty echo. It was a peaceful, contented silence, filled with the rhythm of their breathing. This was his life now. It was messy, and it was covered in cat hair, and it was more beautiful than he could have ever imagined. He reached over to the bookshelf, next to the pile of well-thumbed cat care manuals, and picked up the small, lacquered box where he kept the collection from the windowsill. The feathers, the bottle cap, the ribbon, the sea glass, the tiny pink mitten. He opened the lid and sifted through them with his fingers. They weren't trash anymore. They were a map. They were the story of how he found his way home. As he held the sea glass, its surface worn smooth by the ocean's relentless patience, he felt a nudge against his elbow. It was Ash. She had jumped down from the couch and come over to him. She sniffed the box, then looked up at him. She chirped softly, then turned and padded away into the hallway that led to the bedrooms. This was new. She often followed him, but she rarely led. Curious, he got up, carefully displacing a kitten from his lap. He followed her. She led him to the closed door of the spare bedroom, the room that had been nothing but a storage unit for the ghosts of his old life. Boxes of things he and Sarah had bought together. An exercise bike that served as a very expensive clothes rack. A life suspended in amber. Ash sat down in front of the door and looked at him expectantly. She meowed, a clear, purposeful sound. "What is it, girl?" he asked. "There's nothing in there for you," she meowed again, more insistently, and pawed at the bottom of the door. Bewildered, Leo turned the knob and pushed the door open. The room was dark and smelled faintly of dust. He flicked on the light. The room was just as he'd left it. Boxes piled high. The sheet-covered bike. Ash trotted into the room with a sense of absolute certainty. She went straight to a box labeled Axmas in faded black marker and pawed at it. "You're not helping me decorate for Christmas in March, buddy," he said with a soft laugh. But she was persistent. She looked back at him, her green eyes intent, and meowed again. Something in her determination made his smile fade. He walked over to the box. It was one of Sarah's. She'd taken the ornaments she'd cared about, the ones from her family. This box was full of the generic ones they'd bought together at drugstores. Cheap, glittery balls. A few sad strands of tinsel. He opened the flaps. The smell of old cardboard and cinnamon-scented pine cones wafted out. Ash immediately pushed her head into the box, rummaging around. She emerged a second later, her mouth holding not an ornament, but something that had been tucked away beneath them. It was a small, framed photograph. He'd forgotten it was even there. He took it from her gently. It was a picture of him and Sarah, from maybe their second year together. They were on a beach, squinting into the sun, their arms around each other. They looked happy. They looked young. He stared at his own face, at the easy, unguarded smile of a man who hadn't yet learned about heartbreak. A dull ache, familiar but distant, throbbed in his chest. This was why he'd buried this box. These ghosts. But Ash wasn't done. She nudged his hand with her head, purring loudly. She wasn't showing him a ghost. She was showing him a truth. He looked from the photo in his hand to the cat at his feet. Her green eyes were fixed on him, clear and knowing. And in that moment, he understood the final gift. She wasn't just giving him back a picture. She was giving him back a piece of himself. The man in that photo wasn't a stranger. He was still in there. The capacity for that easy joy, that unguarded love, had never left. It had just been buried under boxes of pain, waiting for a determined, gray cat with torn ears to dig it out. The love he'd had for Sarah had been real. Its end had been real, too. But it wasn't the only love he was capable of. This love, the purring, head-butting, messy, overwhelming love surrounding him now, was realer. It was deeper. It was a love built not on fantasy, but on showing up, on quiet companionship, on weathering storms together. It was a love that demanded nothing but offered everything. He looked down at Ash, his vision blurring with tears. "You incredible creature," he whispered, his voice thick. He placed the photo back in the box. He didn't need to keep it. He didn't need to hide it. It was just a part of his story, a chapter that was over. He picked Ash up, cradling her, against his chest. She purred into his neck, her whole body vibrating with contentment. He carried her out of the room of ghosts and turned off the light, closing the door behind him. He didn't lock it. It was just a door. He walked back into the living room, into the light and the life. Bruiser was attempting to scale the curtains. Peanut was asleep in a tiny fuzzy ball. Pearl and Scout were having a mock battle over a stuffed mouse. This was his life now. Not a life he had built out of the ashes of the old one, but a completely new life, built on a foundation of trust that had been earned one slow blink, one shared meal, one rescued life at a time. He settled back onto the floor, Ash curling up, in the space between his bent knees. He watched his family, his heart so full he thought it might burst. The storm had passed. The long, lonely wait was over. He had learned that love isn't always a grand gesture. Sometimes it's a quiet presence at a bus stop. Sometimes it's a collection of broken things offered as a plea. Sometimes it's a head pressed against your hand in a dark tool shed. And sometimes it's a fierce, furry angel who leads you into a dusty room to show you that your heart wasn't broken after all. It was just waiting for the right ones to find it. You stayed till the end, thank you. If it felt like a soft hug or a warm purr in your heart, subscribing lets me bring you more moments like this.